Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. And this week's contract tip is a continuation from last week's. Several of you asked me to continue on with the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors, Conventional Financing Contingency Exhibit with the appraisal portion of it because of all the time frames below. So on last week's video, I talked about if a buyer is getting a conventional loan and the appraisal comes in low, what to do. So if the buyer, if the appraisal comes in low, and basically the buyer must, if you're binding under the GAR contract, the buyer absolutely must give the seller the opportunity to sell the property for the appraised price by sending an amendment to that seller along with a copy of the appraisal. At that point, if the seller does not accept the amendment and chooses to not sell it at the lower price, then the buyer can terminate. But the buyer can't terminate without sending that amendment. And there are other time frames spelled out. Well, there was some confusion on those time frames. And again, several of you asked me to go through that. So we will continue on with that. So on the GAR exhibit, the GAR Conventional Loan Financing Exhibit, and that is Form F64, under the appraisal contingency paragraph, let me read what it says and then let me give you an example to help you understand it. So basically, the appraisal contingency paragraph, it's paragraph 10, and it in essence says that the whole contract is subject to the property appraising for the contracted sale price. If the property does not appraise for the sale price or greater, then the buyer has within X number of days of the binding agreement date. So the number of days is negotiated between the buyer and the seller, and you fill in the number of days. That initial time frame, the number of days from the binding agreement date, that is not for the buyer to terminate. That is the initial time frame with a low appraisal for the buyer to send to the seller the amendment to the sale price, requesting the seller to see if the seller will agree to sell it for the lower sale price along with a copy of the appraisal. That's all that time frame is. Then the seller then has the right to accept it or reject it. So let me read you that part and then let's go through it on a calendar. So the seller shall accept or reject the amendment to the sale price within the earlier of either 3 days, 3 days from the date that the amendment to the sale price is delivered to the seller, or the closing date, excluding any extensions resulting from unilateral. So whatever the closing date was that was agreed upon on the contract or by an amendment, not the unilateral extension. So the seller has to accept it the earlier of that. If the seller timely accepts the amendment and agrees to sell it for the lower sale price, then the buyer shall be obligated. So if the seller accepts and agrees to sell it for the lower sale price, for the appraised sale price, then the buyer is obligated to go through with the final closing. The buyer shall be obligated to purchase the property. If the seller does not accept the amendment to the sale price, then the buyer shall have the right, but not the obligation, to terminate the agreement without penalty upon giving notice to the seller, provided that the notice is given within 3 days of the earlier of the date that the buyer receives the notice that the seller is not going to accept the lower price, or the last date the seller could have accepted the amendment. In neither circumstance shall the buyer's right to terminate extend beyond the day of closing. Nothing herein shall require the buyer to seek a reduction in the sales price. In such event, the buyer shall be obligated to purchase. Okay, so let's go through what these 3 days and these 3 days are. So the first time frame that the buyer and the seller negotiate, that is the time frame. Again, this is just on the GAR Conventional Loan Contingency Exhibit. That is just the time frame that if the appraisal comes in low, that the buyer must send to the seller an amendment along with a copy of the appraisal asking the seller, do you want to sell it for the lower sale price or not? So that's that initial time frame. Then the seller has 3 days from receiving that amendment to say yes or no. If the seller says no, at that point, the buyer may terminate. If the seller says yes, then the buyer must go through with the price. But let's go through that time frame. So if the seller does nothing, if you don't hear back from the seller, you need to assume that that means they are not accepting the amendment to sell the lower sale price. Then the buyer has 3 days from getting the actual notice from the seller that the seller's not going to sell it, or 3 days from when the seller would have responded. So let me show you on a calendar. I think that will be easier. Let's say that the buyer and the seller agreed, they fill in the blank, 21 days for an appraisal contingency. Basically what that means is the buyer has 21 days from the binding agreement date, if the appraisal comes in low, to send to the seller an amendment requesting the seller to sell for the lower sale price, the amended sale price. So let's say that that is Sunday, December 3rd. That's the 21 days from the binding agreement date. So prior to the end of the day that day, let's say the buyer gets the low appraisal, sends to the seller the amendment asking them to sell the house for the appraised price along with the amendment. The seller then has 3 days from receiving that notice, that amendment requesting this price. 3 days. 1, 2, 3. The seller then has until December 6th to say yes or no. If the seller says no, or if the buyer doesn't hear back from the seller, then the buyer has an additional 3 days from when the seller could have responded. So let's say you don't hear anything from the seller, and the last day the seller could have responded to accept it would have been the 6th. Then the buyer has 3 days, 7th, 8th, 9th. The buyer has until the 9th to actually terminate based on the appraisal contingency and not be penalized, meaning get their earnest money back or not be sued for being in default. So again, it's a little complicated, but make sure you read through that. The time frames are all spelled out, and that's what they are that I just went through. So hopefully that helps explain it a little more. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.